It was 1966, deep in the mountainous rainforest of southern Cotabato in Mindanao. A hunter named Dafal was doing his usual routine of setting up his balatik or pig traps, where he managed to run across a group of so-called wild people foraging for food. Dafal managed to trade with them, teaching them hunting skills and attempts to visit where they were dwelling. Calling themselves the Tasaday, he quickly became their cultural benefactor, where he introduced them to technology of the outside world, starting with iron tools and knives. But unknown to Dafal, his discovery would soon change these people's lives, as their existence reached an influential crony of President Ferdinand Marcos. Soon, numerous celebrities and journalists flocked to the Tasaday dwellings, even outnumbering the Tasaday members themselves when they visited. The media sensationalized the gentle Tasaday as the perfect embodiment of the genuine Stone Age cavemen who lived the same way for thousands of years and were dubbed the anthropological find of the century. But this so-called anthropological find of the century soon became the hoax of the century, and the controversy became even more complicated. Not only is it a story about deceiving the world of a Paleolithic life in the modern age, but it is also a political drama, exposing how the Marcos regime and his cronies exploited indigenous people for international publicity. It is also an academic blood feud as well, between those who not only have long doubted their authenticity, but also have scores to settle against the Marcoses and the researchers who defended it. And more importantly, it is a story of land and resources. The controversy was immediately used by people with vested interests, all seeking to invalidate the Tasaday and claim the rich rainforest for themselves. The chaos made the Tasaday victims of their own circumstance, having their very existence questioned and their rights as indigenous peoples to their ancestral domain being threatened. This is the true story of the most controversial tribe in the Philippines.
If this was a hoax, that's a heck of a story.
It was hailed in the press worldwide as the greatest anthropological find of the century.
This is the ugliest, the most disgusting, the most disgraceful story that I've ever been involved in.
I have my opinions about the exploitation of their existence.
The anthropological world is now bitterly divided.
There are no authorities in science.
The whole thing was staged by Manda Elizalde.
All of these accusations are absolute lies.
To better give context to the story of the Tasaday, we must start not in the jungles of Mindanao, but in the streets of Manila and Washington. It was the start of the 1970s, and the world was in total chaos. In America, it was the rise of the hippie movement protesting against the military draft. And in Southeast Asia, the war in Vietnam dragged on. What was supposed to be a police action turned into an undeclared war of attrition, with both sides suffering massive casualties. America's ally in the region, the Philippines, was vital in the war effort, where it became America's loyal and stable aircraft carrier. But the Philippines wasn't stable either, as President Ferdinand Marcos was struggling in his second term. Like the United States, the Philippines was shaken by increasingly violent protests, such as the first quarter storm in the Diliman commune, opposition politicians being targeted in bombings, an ongoing insurgency by Maoist guerrillas of the New People's Army or the NPA, and a growing Muslim separatist movement of the Moro National Liberation Front or the MNLF, fighting for independence in the island of Mindanao. The island was turned into a battleground between the Marcos regime, the NPA, the MNLF, the Christian settler militias like the Ilaga, political warlords and power brokers, and even private logging and mining companies. And caught in between were the local indigenous tribes, where they were being used by these groups for their own ends. All this domestic unrest looked bad for Washington and worse for Marcos, His government was desperate, and he urgently needed favorable news to counteract the damaging stories flooding the international press. Marcos needed distraction, something beautiful, something purely Filipino, that could put a human face on his escalating dictatorship. Then, in 1971, against this background of war, chaos, and impending martial law, there came a miracle from the Marcoses, and the man who brought this miraculous discovery was his cabinet secretary, Manuel Elizalde Jr., who goes by the name of Manda. Unlike other Marcos officials, Manda belongs to one of the Philippines' richest industrial families, the Elizaldes, owning numerous businesses from mining, logging, manufacturing, liquor production, armaments, and even media broadcasting. Educated from Harvard and a flamboyant tycoon, he lived an eccentric yet extravagant lifestyle. Rumors of his strange activities were constant, from allegedly looting his sister's money and mother's jewelry to allegedly smuggling guns to Indonesia. One of Manda's close friends, the famed aviator Charles Lindbergh, even said that, "He's an extraordinary person, and I'll tell you, I think you got to be very careful about looking into motives." His involvement in tribal affairs allegedly began after encountering a tribal child with a badly mutilated leg during a honeymoon with his wife in Mindoro. This encounter, he would later tell, sparked an immediate, almost frantic desire to help the Philippines overlook tribal groups.
And I think this has to be acknowledged. At the same time, the indigenous peoples of the Philippines in the 1960s, they were not being paid attention to by anyone. And it was not cool to be indigenous. When people who were tribal went into towns, in the northern Philippines, elsewhere, they would often dress differently when they went into town because they'd be made fun of otherwise.
Using his family's wealth, he equipped a yacht with medical equipment and embarked on humanitarian missions, claiming to have treated over 1.5 million people, a number that, whether true or not, painted the picture of a visionary idealist and philanthropist. In 1965, Ferdinand Marcos ran for president under the Nacionalista Party and won. The Elizaldes supported his bid for the presidency, and soon, Manda's crusading work got the attention of the First Lady Imelda Marcos. He was eventually appointed as a key cabinet secretary, heading an agency dedicated to protecting ethnic minorities called the Presidential Assistance on National Minorities, or PANAMIN. At the same time, he already had a private foundation that was established in 1968 called the Private Assistance for National Minorities, also called PANAMIN. It now existed as two entities, both as a private foundation and a government body similar to America's Bureau of Indian Affairs. And Manda wielded absolute control of the agency. And the motives in heading PANAMIN were mostly what his critics call enforced primitivism, where at one point refusing to provide aid to tribal groups if they don't look tribal enough.
A lot of people who had no tribal affiliation, who were, Christians or lowlanders or whatever, they would dress in tribal outfits as well, just so they could get, medical treatment. And so he had this idea of being kind of being a bit of a savior.
PANAMIN's role now went far beyond simple welfare checks. Critics, both inside and outside the Philippines, started to see that Manda's mission had two phases. On one side, he was heading into remote villages in his private helicopter, genuinely providing food, clothing, and tools for these groups. He set up development projects and made sure cameras were always around to capture it. He even adopted 50 children from minority groups, bringing them to live in his luxurious Manila mansions and paying for their education, calling them his scholars. But beneath this facade lay a more sinister agenda, benefiting both Manda and the dictatorship. For Marcos and his associates, its long-term purpose was centered on resource control, as the tribal lands were rich in resources, containing vast amounts of valuable materials like copper, gold, and manganese, and covered in profitable timber. Under the guise of protection, Panamin began a massive program of creating reservations. By the end of 1977, Manda Elizalde had organized over 2.6 million indigenous people into 400 reservations across the country. Panamin was also a military tool, serving as a counterinsurgency arm of Manda and Marcos. It made the cultural minorities they control into paramilitary units, fighting communist and Muslim guerrilla forces in Mindanao. Manda Elizalde started arming these tribes, handing out hundreds of weapons, and turning the Manobo and Tiboli into the most militarized indigenous groups in the island.
There was some talk of kind of militarizing the indigenous people. Remember Vietnam? In Vietnam, that had happened with the Hmong and other mountain people.
The Montagnard program.
Montagnard's program. So there were a lot of reasons for Marcos to co-opt Manda Elizalde.
There were also rumors by critics that Manda's handling of the agency was ruthless, and that there were testimonies where he allegedly tortured people, and at one point roasted a Tiboli man alive inside an oil drum. Whether these allegations were true or not, one thing is clear about Manda, and it is the fact that he craved media attention, an obsession some former Panamin scholars noted as a key part of his personality. In 1971, when he ran for senator on the Marcos ticket, he published a campaign magazine filled with stories about his work with minorities. To quote Manda,
"I have accepted the draft as a senatorial candidate of the Nationalista Party in my desire to bridge the gap between the haves and the have-nots and to awaken the social conscience of the people on the sad state of the cultural minorities in the Philippines."
Then came the discovery that would make Manda internationally famous, one that would put Panamin on the world stage and would cement his reputation as the great protector of tribal people. Manda receives a report from a lone Manobo blit hunter named The Fall, where he claims that hidden deep in the jungles of southern Cotabato, there lived a lost tribe who got seemingly pulled from the Stone Age. Taking all the glory to himself, Manda soon announced to the world his discovery of this Stone Age tribe. They call themselves the Tasaday. The Tasaday were a group of around 24 to 26 forest dwellers who, according to Manda Elizalde, have been living in complete isolation for thousands of years. Consisting of around 6 families, they were headed by Bilangan alongside his wife Edith. The group practiced monogamy, a far cry from the polygamous culture of their nearby Tiboli and Manobo neighbors, some 2.5 miles or 4 kilometers away. And almost immediately, the machinery of myth-making began to turn, as they were considered to be a window into humanity's peaceful past, a way to distance people from the chaos of the 1970s. They had no words for war, enemy, nor even the sea, despite only living 22 kilometers from the nearest coastline. After their discovery in June 1971, Manda Elizalde and Dr. Robert Fox of the National Museum soon released a report in July titled The Tasaday Forest People, initially labeling them as a stone tool using group. Edith Terry served as one of Panamin's interns during the Tasaday expedition.
We met all of them once we went down into the forest and into a stream. When we got down to the stream and started talking with them through a sort of a ladder of interpreters, that was when Manda said, "Oh, we see what you're wearing today, but what did you wear before?" And at that point, because they went up the stream and came back wearing basically plaited leaves, they did it within I would say 15 to 20 minutes at the most. And they looked, much better. They didn't take the brass earrings out. If there was any jewelry, that was still on them. It doesn't show up in the photos that I wasn't taking photos, but the AP had a photographer.
But science was already taking a back seat to the spectacle. Manda cultivated a cult of personality so intense that the Tasaday reportedly began to idolize him, calling him Momodakal Dewata Tasaday, which translates to the great man, god of the Tasaday. The Tasaday mythology goes that their ancestors had prophesied the arrival of a white bird and a god who would bring them everything they need. The announcement sends shockwaves throughout the global media. Between 1971 and 1974, 41 journalists and filmmakers were ushered into the caves, compared to only 12 scientists. One of these journalists is John Nance from the Associated Press, who would soon become the Tasaday's primary storyteller. Nance took many photos during his visits, which were eventually published in various books, such as The Gentle Tasaday, a Stone Age people in the Philippine rainforest. NBC paid $50,000 for exclusive rights to film a documentary called Cave People of the Philippines, starring Jack Reynolds. National Geographic, with its 8 million subscribers, ran a cover story that captured the global imagination, making them the Stone Age tribe in the modern world. One of the Tasaday children, named Lobo, climbing and swinging in the vines, almost similar to Mowgli in Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book. The Tasaday became the gentle face of the Philippines, a perfect PR distraction for the Marcos regime. Marcos and Manda turned the caves into a tourist stop for the elite. The aforementioned aviator Charles Lindbergh came to visit, as did Mariola Ardid, granddaughter of Spanish dictator Francisco Franco, and Italian actress Gina Lollobrigida. Even Imelda Marcos flew in, declaring herself changed by the experience, and became part of her ideological worldview concerning the true, the good, and the beautiful. Ugh. The Marcos regime even incorporated the Tasaday into its propaganda, featuring them in an elaborate introductory parade called Kasaysayan ng Lahi during the 1974 Miss Universe pageant.
They are followed by the famed tribe of the Tasadays. These are descendants of the first Filipinos. Their tribal names suggest the strange and the unknown.
The Tasaday, so far as I know, were exempt from that. They were not part of those parades, or if they were, it was not, the actual Tasaday people, but people kind of in costume.
During President Gerald Ford's visit to the Philippines in 1975, the regime used 2 Tiboli men under Panamin's payroll, named George Tanedo and Sam Gangusto, to dress up as Tasaday. They were paraded in front of the American president as authentic Stone Age survivors, and were later referred to by critics as Xerox Tasaday. But eventually, the mirage began to reveal itself, and soon, cracks began to show as numerous inconsistencies about the Tasaday started to emerge. In the 1970s, the world had fallen in love with the Tasaday story. But even as the cameras rolled and the headlines screamed about Stone Age people frozen in time, not everyone was convinced. The skepticism began almost immediately as soon as they were discovered. It came from Manda Elizalde's wife, the academic world, and from the people of South Cotabato themselves, as the locals who had lived in the area for generations knew something was deeply wrong with the story. Manda's relationship with his wife, Maria Carmen Marti, has never been stable, at one point threatening her to be detained in a psychiatric hospital in the United States, and even filed for divorce to secure custody of their children.
Maria met with me, and she made all these sensational claims, including, and who knows, but she said that he had her committed to a mental institution.
Yeah, that's what I read.
Yeah, and that she had escaped. I can't remember. She had escaped in some dramatic fashion, and that and that and who knows? I don't know. But she was very. She made a lot of sensational claims.
She claimed that one of the reasons he left Manda was because he was fabricating the Tasaday story in collaboration with Charles Lindbergh. She even went so far as accusing Manda of allegedly, how should I say this? Diddied a group of children, beating and blinding them at one point, and had even done a hoax rehearsal somewhere in Palawan with John Nance. Whether these bizarre allegations were true or not, her testimony provided a narrative that linked the discovery to Manda's personal and political ambitions. In the academic world, the first major critique came by sheer happenstance. It started when a professor named Zeus Salazar stumbled into the Tasaday when he was translating a German linguistics book for one of the Tasaday on-site researchers.
Ang unang footnote ko ay tungkol sa ulat yata ni Dr. Jamson. Napunta lang sa bahay at sinabi niya nagpunta sila sa Tasaday. So, kinumentaryan ko yung kanyang papel. That's all. Ginagawa ko lang yung dapat gawin ng isang profesor, di ba?
Salazar wrote 2 journal articles labeled as footnotes, critiquing Panamin's research findings. Despite all the sensational claims in newspapers and TV screens, there was almost no actual data, as the information about the Tasaday was, in Salazar's words, tenuous at best. To quote Zeus Salazar,
"One is nonetheless disconcerted at the paucity and the tenuous nature of our information regarding the Tasaday. Of course, the most obvious aspects of their material culture have been observed, recorded, and even interpreted with some diligent alacrity. But the more significant ones can begin to become apparent only when the non-material culture shall have been more securely solicited."
In short, the information about the Tasaday was thin, very thin. But it was the language that gave it away. Salazar found a smoking gun, the word Diwata, from the term Momodakal Diwata Tasaday, referring to Manda Elizalde. The problem was that, according to Salazar, Diwata is a Sanskrit loanword.
Diwata ay isang katagang Sanskrit na pumasok sa Pilipinas mula sa Indonesia.
If the Tasaday used this word, they couldn't have been isolated for thousands of years, at most around 150 years, and certainly did not reach back to the Stone Age. One of the Tasaday researchers, the linguist Carol Maloney, later has an answer to Salazar's analysis.
I did, in my publication of the 70s, point out that Tasaday have the term Diwata. They use it in only one context, and that is to refer to Manda Elizalde. They don't use it in the context you would expect to use the term deity. That leads me to believe that it may be a recent loanword, and in fact they say that they learned that term from the Fal to refer to Elizalde.
Hindi lamang dyan, Maloney ay linguist, no? At saka wala siyang alam doon sa Pilipinas in the first place. Dinala lang sa aeroplano sa Maynila tapos patunaw ng helicopter. Alam ko may dala-dala siya ng kanyang anak na babae, di ba?
Then there was the word Faiz. Panamin said it meant striker and referred to that stone axes that Tasaday used before meeting outsiders. When the Fal showed them a metal knife, they supposedly reused the word Faiz for this new tool. They called the old stone axe Faiz Batu. Zeus Salazar saw it differently and says the explanation does not make sense. According to Salazar, when a new important object enters a culture, people usually give it a name, often based on the person who introduced it. So if the bolo knife were truly new to the Tasaday, it should have been called Faiz the Fal instead. Apart from Diwata and Faiz, the Tasaday had other words such as roof, bronze, and grain, as these words were mostly used by agricultural communities, not by Stone Age forest foragers who had never seen the outside world. Zeus Salazar made a lot of valid points, but they were ignored. As Panamin was preparing a publication about the Tasaday, it included positive comments and endorsements from other researchers, but any dissent and criticism was excluded, leading to Salazar's accusation of suppression.
One of the basic issues that Philippine academics had with him was the sense that he just sort of dismissed them. They weren't world class. So he had the money and the resources and the mindset to get the best experts in the world. And not many of them were from UP. I think that was always a problem, especially Salazar. There was sort of a jealousy thing going on there.
Actually, isang beses pinuntan ako ni Nance, turo ako sa UST noon. Inimbita niya ako doon. Ang mahirap yan kung pupunta ka doon, nasa kamay ka na ni Elizalde. Mahirap yung, ang nagdadala sa'yo dyan, yung helicopter ni Elizalde.
When martial law began, Salazar was detained for his involvement in the Diliman commune. He was locked up alongside writer Butch Dalaysay and a certain American historian named William Henry Scott, who years earlier debunked a certain code of sorts where I might have made a video about. I wonder what that is. Fortunately, Zeus Salazar was immediately released. With regards to the Tasaday, he wasn't alone in his doubts. Even among the carefully selected scientists that Manda personally chose to visit the Tasaday, cracks were beginning to show. David Baradas and his colleague Carlos Fernandez tried to conduct longer, more thorough studies, but apart from the fact that they weren't given a translator, they were only allowed into the caves with permission, and Manda Elizalde forbade them from sleeping inside. The researchers discovered something troubling.
First, he noticed that cooked rice was being sneaked into the caves.
Our repeated request not to dole out food in order for us to get a more real view of their daily activity fall on deaf ears.
They attempted to extend their fieldwork, but within days, armed men fired gunshots over their tents during the night.
He was evacuated by helicopter, but he was puzzled. No one was wounded, and Elizalde and his staff were so unconcerned that they stayed behind at a site supposedly under attack. Baradas is now convinced that it was all a put-up job designed by Elizalde to get him hurrying back to civilization.
And that totally ended the expedition. And there have been no anthropologist or research study done after our departure. So we could really say here that there had been no studies on the Tasaday.
Then there was Douglas Yen, an ethnobotanist who spent more time with the Tasaday than almost any other scientist. Yen was studying their diet and food sources. What he found was that the Tasaday's calorie intake was like trying to survive on a vegan diet in the desert. It was mathematically impossible. Based solely on their gathering activities, they weren't getting enough calories to sustain themselves. They should be losing weight and growing weak. Yet they appeared healthy and energetic. And like Baradas and Fernandez, Yen also saw rice being smuggled from his research camp to the caves. Then there were the stone tools themselves, which the Tasaday called heirlooms passed down for generations. Early reports from Panamin researchers describe them as some of the most primitive ever recorded, scrapers and edge-ground river stones that humans in the Philippines haven't used for about 2,000 years. But Zeus Salazar criticized that the stone tools were fake, and they were demonstration models made to order.
I am afraid that if I used it just once, it would break completely.
So roughly then, how old would you say those so-called Stone Age tools are?
Well, I suppose they were made during the time of nuns, so this should be something like 13, 14 years old.
And how do they compare with things which you genuinely know are Stone Age tools?
Oh, they are quite different, completely different. If you compare both these tools, this tool and this supposed tool, you'll notice that this one is shaped and it is polished. This is from the Neolithic, of course. Whereas this one is just a pebble from the river.
He noted that they were fabricated by sharpening them against a rock, as one would do with a metal tool, suggesting prior knowledge of metallurgy. The demonstration models presented to the cameras were crudely made in under 15 minutes, clearly unusable after a few strokes, poorly shaped and poorly attached using rattan that had been cut with metal blades.
Not all the experts agree. At the University of Kent in England, archaeologist Ian Glover.
And those tools, it seems, would be quite adequate for crushing nuts, for scraping rattan, and a certain number of tasks like this. They weren't used for very heavy-duty tasks. But from everything that we know about the Tasaday, they were not clearing the forest, building houses, hollowing out canoes, and so on. No, the mere fact that the Tasaday tools seem to be so simply made and so crude and so irregular by itself doesn't convince me that they are a fake. We have to take into consideration the other sort of evidence.
Manda Elizalde made tape recordings consisting of several hours of conversations with the Tasaday. John Nance published excerpts in his book. They revealed the Tasaday talked frequently about Manda, referring to him as Momo Dakal Diwata Tasaday. The phrase appeared again and again that it got abbreviated as MDDT. To some observers, the frequency seemed unnatural and excessive. According to one study, MDDT appeared 439 times, comprising about 1/8 or around 12.5% of the total words in the whole transcript. The tapes suddenly disappeared. For over 2 decades, they were reported lost or misplaced. And 3 of the researchers, namely Robert Fox, Frank Lynch, and David Baradas, eventually resigned from Panamine and distanced themselves from conducting Tasaday research, as they had serious concerns about how Manda was prioritizing sensationalism. Fox later revealed that he resigned because he was absolutely disgusted with Elizalde and that he found it intolerable to try to work with him, and that Manda was the most arrogant person he had ever met, an egomaniac. Frank Lynch followed suit, delivering a damning indictment of the whole operation. Public relations seemed to take a higher priority than science. The actual research was shockingly thin. Lynch and Fernandez estimated that the total time scientists spent with the Tasaday was less than 125 hours, barely a week and a half of cumulative study. While Manda's wife and the academic world were quietly expressing their concerns, the locals of South Cotabato were far less diplomatic. As the international media celebrated the discovery as the find of the century, rumors began to circulate in South Cotabato that the Tasaday were a stunt.
Mariano Mondragon, who lived in the Tasaday area for 50 years, he told us that he challenged the Tasaday story from the outset.
I attack him on that issue of Tasaday, because Tasaday is not a tribe. It is only Rizali that's making it a tribe. It's concoction based on making. There is no real Tasaday. They are Tombolis, they are Manobos. In fact, some of them are my in-laws, with their pictures as Tasadays.
The geography alone made isolation impossible. Local residents pointed out that the Tasaday caves were a 2.5 mile or 4 kilometer walk from the nearest settlement of Blit.
And I think this whole idea of the proximity of Blit to the Tasaday is something the Hoth proponents have raised a number of times. But again, you have to go there to see how it's not just a matter of proximity. It's incredibly rugged territory, and going from Blit to this Tasaday area is not just like walking in Makati. something like that. You know, it's arduous, it takes time. Wouldn't have taken as much time for the people, obviously, who live there. But also, I think to go into the rainforest at that time was not just something that people just regularly did. You know, there are all kinds of reasons why people stay out of it. And so my belief, and again, this is just my feeling, is that they knew of one another but didn't interact a lot.
Even the name Tasaday raised eyebrows among locals. People in Surala, the nearest major town, claimed that there was no tribe called the Tasaday. It was a Tiboli or Manobo word meaning mountaintop. According to local knowledge, Manda Elizalde had simply named them after the place where they were found. Local government officials were even more blunt. Governor Sergio Morales of South Cotabato publicly stated that the Tasaday were "Invento lang ni Elizalde yan." Mayor Jose Sison of Surala went even further. He hated Manda to the point that he attempted to eliminate him on numerous occasions. In one incident, Manda was traveling in Mindanao with Charles Lindbergh, where his convoy was stopped by Sison's men. A tense standoff ensued, with Manda and Lindbergh's guns at the ready. But what was supposed to be an ambush turned into a photo op instead, where Lindbergh was declared an honorary police chief of Surala. As for the Tasaday, he openly denounced it as a hoax and accused Manda Elizalde of creating the story to generate funds and facilitate his control over prospective mining operations in the Tasaday area. Other local leaders echoed these sentiments. A Manobo chieftain immediately dismissed the Stone Age claims as nothing but a hoax when he wrote his newspaper article in 1972. The local press in South Cotabato tried to investigate, but they complained that Hanamin personnel prohibited them from visiting the area. Even missionaries who were working the region, such as the Santa Cruz mission, had their own doubts.
There were times when he would go and he would sit at a table and he would put stacks and stacks of money, like 50 peso bills, still in their original folders, and maybe there'd be tens of thousands of pesos piled up on the top of the table, and this was to impress people. I mean, here was money, and he said, and you know, as part of their conflict with us, they said, now, you want to see my God? Here is my God.
By 1974, the situation had reached a critical point. The scientific doubts were mounting, and local resistance was growing louder. And then, suddenly, the debate was shut down entirely. Citing the need to protect the Tasaday from the harmful effects of civilization, Manda Elizalde successfully petitioned President Marcos to declare a massive 45,000-acre reservation called the Tasaday Manovo Special Forest Reserve. Subsequent decrees, such as Presidential Decree 1017, made unauthorized entry a crime punishable by imprisonment. For the next decade, the Tasaday would remain hidden behind a barrier of government restrictions. For years, the Tasaday narrative became deeply entrenched in both local and global education, particularly in the United States. They became a fixture in school curricula worldwide. Hundreds of thousands of university students were taught in anthropology courses that the Tasaday were an extremely primitive, stone tool-using culture, living in virtual isolation from other peoples. In political peace movements, the Tasaday were presented as a people who lived an idyllic life, free of greed and war, and provided an ethnographic model of a non-violent and peaceful egalitarian community. They were even featured in the documentary If Japan Can, Why Can't We? By the Deming Institute, teaching about quality control.
Deep in the jungle of the Philippines, the Tasaday, a Stone Age tribe, spend all their time looking for food.
But as the Tasaday remained isolated within their own time capsule, the inevitable forces of history finally caught up with them when political changes swept across the Philippines. On August 21, 1983, the chief political rival of President Ferdinand Marcos, Senator Benigno Ninoy Aquino, was shot at Manila International Airport. His assassination sends shockwaves throughout the Philippines, with protests erupting across the country and Marcos' grip on power weakening. For Manda Elizalde, he sees the writing on the wall. And months after Ninoy's assassination, he becomes one of the first Marcos cronies to flee the Philippines. According to Panamin staff members, he allegedly stole between 25 and 45 million pesos of the organization's funds, effectively bankrupting the organization. There were even rumors when he allegedly took 25 to 28 young tribal women as his personal harem into exile. Panamin, once a powerful government agency, collapsed in 1984. For years, critics had accused Manda Elizalde of using the Tasaday discovery as a cover for securing exclusive access to the forest's natural resources for himself and to other Marcos allies, sometimes calling the organization as Penamines. Then, in February 1986, millions of Filipinos poured into the streets of Manila along EDSA. The People Power Revolution forced Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos to flee the country, ending 2 decades of authoritarian rule. Ninoy's widow, Corazon Cory Aquino, becomes president. The presidential decree that sealed the Tasaday Reserve falls into limbo. In March 1986, just weeks after Cory's inauguration, a Swiss journalist named Oswald Iten decided to investigate the rumors about the Tasaday story.
My story with the Tasaday started a year before, in 85. I arrived in Manila actually on the day that Marcos faked his election, when I met the Bishop of Mindanao. I met the Bishop by chance. I have read, of course, about the Tasaday. I also studying anthropology and economics, and everybody knew the Tasaday story and has seen the pictures. And I actually praised Mr. Marcos for creating a reserve and protecting this Tasaday. And I thought this was one of the few things, of the positive things that Marcos did to the people. But the bishop laughed and said, don't you know, it's a hoax. He was the first person who said that word, and he said, my priests know so-called Tasaday when I go to the market. So I didn't believe him, the bishop, because I thought, after many weeks I went back from the Philippines. I was thinking, it's interesting that bishop says it's a hoax. So let me read everything what I can find. So there was an entirely new situation. There was no more any guards on the Tasaday reservation, and I could just fly to Surallah and meet with the local priest, and that he would inform the bishop about my wish to go to the caves. And so the bishop sent me a journalist from his own weekly newspaper. Joy Lozano was about to accompany me and also act as a translator at the same time. So I had no idea how long this trip would be and what we would encounter, because all trips to the Tasaday before, they were done by helicopter, landing on a tree platform. So I assumed maybe this would go 1 or 2 weeks to reach those caves. So it was just 14 hours from the nearest tarmac of the airport to the Stone Age caves. So we had a lot of supplies left. We didn't carrying a lot because we thought we would go hungry otherwise. Within a few hours, Bilangan also appeared and he was showing us his nipa house. And then next morning we walked to the caves, and when we reached the caves, there were obviously no use long time. There was former furniture which was added in the last days of the Tasaday hype in the 70s was decayed already. Nobody ever used. And it was Ilangan and his sons were all climbing again into the upper cave in the same way as they did Angels and all the days for the National Geographic. Actually, I've seen the National Geographic carried with me. That I've seen it for the first, and they were having a lot of fun looking at the old photographs and at comparing their faces from the old days to the present day. We didn't spend so much time there because it was just stories, They told me how they were led or even forced to stay at the caves and participate in all this. For them, it must have also been some distraction and some fun to be at the center of all this interest,
Iten published his findings in the Swiss newspaper, declaring the Tasaday story a Stone Age swindle. The German magazine Stern immediately dispatches its own team to investigate. Reporter Walter Unger and photographer J. Ulal arrived about a week after Iten's visit. But unlike Iten, who traveled with local activists, the Stern crew hired the Fall as their guide. Before leading the German reporters into the forest, the Fall spent 6 days scouting the path alone. The journey from Blit only takes more than a day's difficult walking, but Unger and Ulal grow suspicious. When the Stern team finally reached the caves, it was packed with 49 Tasaday, all wearing leaf coverings. But upon closer inspection, underwear peeks out beneath the leaves. These were the same people Iten photographed in t-shirts and jeans just 1 week earlier. Then, things took a dark turn. The Fall suddenly leaves the Stern team at the caves. As Walter Unger and J. Ulal were preparing to depart, armed men emerged from the forest and surrounded them. They seized the reporters at gunpoint. They were only released after Stern magazine paid an undisclosed ransom. Despite the ordeal, or perhaps because of it, Walter Unger and J. Ulal reached the same conclusion as Oswald Iten. The Tasaday story was a hoax. The news reached a reporter for AVC named Judith Moses. She was intrigued by the story and immediately pitched it to her network. They agreed to fund an investigation for their program 2020 with a team led by Moses and a local journalist named Joey Lozano as their guide. The controversy exploded on American television.
ABC 2020.
Tonight, Stone Age cavemen discovered in a Philippine forest in the early 70s. They shocked the world and changed history books. They were primitive, peaceful, and phony.
If this was a hoax, that's a heck of a story.
The truth that could change history back. The truth behind the tribe that never was.
On camera, the Tasaday members explain how Manda Elizalde coerced them to take off their clothes, pose for the cameras, and act primitive.
Why did you go to the caves and take off your clothing and appear to be primitive cavemen?
Elizalde said if we went naked, we'd get aid because we'd look poor.
In return, to quote Judith Moses,
they said that they were promised food, which is very important to them. They said they were promised clothing, and much to our astonishment, they were promised their own helicopter.
Were they rewarded? Did they get help?
None. We're poorer now than we were before.
As 1986 draws to a close, the Tasaday controversy has transformed from a story about an isolated Stone Age tribe into something far more complex. A tangled web of politics, media warfare, competing institutions, and accusations of exploitation. The scientific community now prepares to weigh in. The University of the Philippines announces plans for a major conference to examine all available evidence and attempt to resolve the controversy once and for all. Seven months after the People Power Revolution, Filipino academics finally had something they've been waiting for years. For over a decade, critics of the Tasaday story had kept quiet, afraid of arrest, lawsuits, or worse. But now, with Marcos gone, the gloves were coming off. Jerome Bailen, an anthropologist from the University of the Philippines Diliman, stood before a packed conference room as chairman of the International Anthropological Conference on the Tasaday controversy and other urgent anthropological issues. He had one goal: to settle this debate once and for all. It should be of national concern, as Filipinos were actually involved in the alleged fraud. A Philippine cultural group was a victim of this fraud, and Filipino agencies, organizations, and associations, by their active endorsement, quiet acquiescence, if not total unconcern, helped voice the Tasaday consciousness on the world. The conference promised what they called a genuine dialogue, but what unfolded over 3 days in August would be anything but calm discussion. It became a rival brawl between academics and researchers from UP Diliman against those from the Ateneo de Manila University, the National Museum, and Panamin. It should be noted that UP Diliman had a long history of being anti-Marcos and tends to suspect anyone associated with the Marcos regime. Scores were about to be settled, and the hoax proponents had come prepared, and they were ready to make their case. Zeus Salazar took the stage with what he believed was bombshell evidence. He unfurled a series of genealogical charts, tracing the lines between the Tasaday and neighboring tribes. According to these charts, the Tasaday weren't an isolated group at all. They were relatives of people living just miles away. Salazar admitted the charts had been drawn up quickly, just before the conference, based on the information from George Tanedo, one of the Xerox Tasaday, who was presented to President Ford in 1975. Salazar introduced a delegation of tribal Filipinos who claimed to be relatives of the Tasaday. One after another, the hoax proponents presented their case, such as ethnologist Christian Adler, when, during his undercover fieldwork in 1985, a year before Marcos' ouster, chose not to publicize his findings at the time so as to protect the local people from potential government retaliation. It wasn't until finally Bailen played the video that started it all, ABC's The Tribe That Never Was. The room-watched natives confessed on camera they'd been paid to dress up, paid to pretend they were Stone Age cavemen.
Were you asked to take your clothing off and wear a G-string or a fig leaf and pose in the nude?
Yes, Elizalde did tell me to put on a G-string and become a Tasaday.
Were you ever offered special incentive for your tribe if you would go along with and join the Tasaday?
There's a time when Elizalde offered me both money and rifle if I agreed to become a Tasaday. But I turned him down.
But sitting in that audience were the people who'd been there in 1971, most especially John Nance. They pushed back and maintained their position. The Tasaday were a real and distinct group. They just changed rapidly when they met the modern world. The proceedings turned theatrical. Nance and others accused the organizers of rigging the conference, of not giving them enough time to defend themselves. One American observer stood up and called it an ethnographic inquisition. His warnings went nowhere. The controversy exploded. In October 1987, the House of Representatives opened an investigation. Scientists, journalists, tribal members, government officials all testified.
When I was asked at one of the committee meetings to preside, I was so confused and so bewildered by the exchange of views. Instead of hearing the witnesses, the committee members themselves were arguing. There was a motion on the part of one of the committee members, that is Congressman Jusoberi, to have the case closed.
Why?
Because we cannot come at a conclusion as to whether this Tasaday is genuine or not.
The investigation concludes that this was a scientific matter, not a political one. However, in their final report, they confirmed the authenticity of the Tasaday, with President Cory Aquino publicly endorsing the conclusion.
Cory Aquino ay pumasok at nagsabi na authentic ang Tasaday. Sabi ko, kailan ba naging anthropologist si Cory Aquino? Pero huwag sa makialam sa amin.
Two competing narratives now existed. Either the Tasaday were genuine, and the hoax proponents opened the door for logging and mining interests to exploit their land, or that the Tasaday were fake, created by Manda to monopolize those same resources. Both sides accused the other of the identical crime, using ethnic groups as pawns to control land and wealth. But the story was far from over. The debate was about to go international. July 1988, Zagreb, Yugoslavia. The International Congress of Anthropological and Ethnological Sciences had a special session on the Tasaday. It was a massive gathering of anthropologists from around the world. Hoax proponents such as Salazar and Moses flew in. It was meant to be the final nail in the coffin of the Tasaday myth. But what they didn't anticipate was Manda Elizalde paying attention. When word reached him, he made calls, and former Panamanian associates received plane tickets. So did John Nance.
Pumunta pa sila sa Zagreb sa base pa na natives. Ang mahirap dyan yung mukhang isang Amerikano ang sumama sa kanila.
What happened next was exactly what everyone feared, a circus.
The level of the actors and victims, the making of a hoax.
George Tenedo was the source of this data. The same George Tenedo has signed an affidavit.
We'll have plenty of discussion of all of these issues.
I mean, you keep saying those things and dismissing this, and you say that after I sit there and listen to Judith Moses.
See, this is turning into a circus, and it is not possible to probably discuss the issues.
There are no authorities in science. Even the greatest authorities are liable to be.
I believe that Dr. Salazar has made his evidence very well. I'm demographic, linguistic, ethnological, ethnobotanical grounds. We cannot sustain the argument that this is an independent country.
This is the ugliest, the most disgusting, the most disgraceful story that I've ever been involved in. The reason why it took off is I think it was a combination of second-rate science and fifth-rate reporting.
It got so heated that Yugoslavian security guards even intervened and confiscated papers. One hoax proponent spoke for nearly an hour until another anthropologist interrupted if this was a filibuster. It was chaos. Character assassination, aggressive tactics from both sides, the credibility of anthropology itself took a hit. A linguist named Lawrence Reed decided to investigate the language. If the Tasaday were really just Manobo and Tiboli, dressed up by Manda Elizalde, their language should show clear signs of it. Reed would spend months analyzing the evidence.
The only way, I think, is for anthropologists and ethnologists to learn the language of the group that they are examining or that they are researching on. Without a knowledge of the language, they are able to rely on what other people say. I think the key is understanding the language.
Zagreb failed to settle anything. Both sides left convinced they were right. Both sides left angry. Something had to change. November 1989, Washington, D.C. The American Anthropological Association was holding its 80th annual meeting, and tucked into the schedule was a special invited session, the Tasaday Controversy, assessing the evidence. The AAA had asked anthropologist Thomas Headland to organize it. He learned from the mistakes of Zagreb and had only one rule: no circus. Everyone would get exactly 15 minutes to speak, no exceptions. Behind the scenes, both camps lobbied heavily in the weeks leading up to the conference. ABC's Judith Moses led the charge for the hoax proponents. Manda Elizalde's people lobbied from the other side. When representatives of Manda Elizalde reached out offering financial help, even offering headland and no-strings-attached funding after he was rejected a grant by the National Science Foundation, he turned them down as he couldn't risk any appearance of a bias. When the session convened, something remarkable happened. The atmosphere was calm and scholarly. People presented evidence, not accusations. The first bombshell came from Panamanian researchers who spent months gathering genealogical data in the field. Their findings directly contradicted the charts presented by Salazar. Even more striking, they tracked down 14 individuals who now claimed they've been bribed to pretend to be Tasaday relatives.
I told lies about the Tasaday. That Lobo is my uncle, and Bilangan is my grandfather.
I was instructed to claim that my uncles are Udelen and Lefuno.
Now, where are you supposed to say these things?
Uncle George Tañedo instructed me to tell this to UP.
Are there Tasadays?
I was asked to say that there's no Tasaday and that Lobo and the rest are Tiboli.
But there are really Tasadays?
Yes, sir, there are Tasadays.
Then, Lawrence Reed presented his linguistic analysis, which was the key in supporting their authenticity, as the language cannot be fabricated. After careful study, he concluded that the Tasaday spoke a genuine dialect of Manobo. They were a real ethno-linguistic group, not actors reading lines.
In the paper that I've written called Linguistic Archaeology, I talked about the evidence that some of the Tasaday forms, the words, were found in the Kulaman Valley as well, and not in Lake Manobo. And there are some words which are found in other languages in the Philippines, which are not found anymore in Manobo languages. They're not reported in any of the dictionaries, which the Tasaday continued to use. So these forms were probably lost in other Manobo languages, while the Tasaday remembered them or used them still. One of the words is the term to dance, baliwas, which is found in other languages in the northern Philippines. And they could not have known that word apart from retaining that word from older forms of the language.
One archaeologist proposed something radical. Stop arguing and start digging. A controlled excavation of the cave could find physical evidence of how long people had lived there. Layers of refuse don't lie.
Kung matagal ka roon, yung kinakain ninyo ay nilalagay sa isang lugar. So doon sa lugar na kung matagal kayo doon, tumutubo yun. No?
Yun nga po yung ang kiniklaim po, wala rin midden.
Yeah, midden nga. Midden ang tawag dyan. Kailangan yung midden nandun. Kumakain sila, hindi ba? Mayroong waste. No? Yung midden yan, kailangan doon sa harapan ng kuweba. Walang ganun sa malinis yung kuweba eh.
By the end, a consensus emerged, but not the consensus anyone expected.
It was a very interesting and fruitful conference because you had at the end publication, very interesting to read it because all the papers were giving a good summary, and even the main author of the book at the end, he said the conclusion, a hoax or not.
If you mean, was it a hoax? Do you mean were these people paid performers, paid to go in from outside and pose in the rainforest as some kind of primitive Stone Age people? Then I'd say in that sense it wasn't a hoax. Now if you're asking me, were there exaggerations, were there untrue stories told about the Tasaday, then in that sense it was a hoax. There were certainly gross exaggerations made about the Tasaday. And one thing that's important to remember is these exaggerations, these false reports, perhaps made unwittingly by journalists, media people, and maybe even scientists that were excited about what they were finding, they exaggerated the stories. But you must remember there were also untrue, incorrect statements made in the 1980s, in my opinion, by people that were claiming that it was a hoax.
Ang maganda dyan talaga sa Tasaday ay maraming nakikinabang, lalo na mga journalist.
Dami po eh. NBC,
Paulit-ulit eh.
not JO.
Paulit-ulit.
The Tasaday were not Stone Age people, living exactly as their ancestors had for thousands of years. That romantic vision was rejected by virtually every scholar in the room. But they also weren't a complete hoax, nor paid actors. That claim was rejected too. The Tasaday were a genuine minority tribal people. Their presentation to the world in 1971 had been marked by exaggeration and political exploitation.
And the other side, they would say, okay, we agree it was not Stone Age, but they are a separate tribe. So no Stone Age, but yes, separate ethnic entity, which is a joke. If you read even about the language and everything, it's more convenient for the most people. If you say Stone Age, no, a separate ethnic entity, yes. Let's keep it like that. Nobody is against that. It's certainly not agreeing to the ethnicity.
Hedlund published the conference papers in the book. In the final chapter, he laid out 8 specific facts that few anthropologists still disputed. These 8 facts painted a picture far different from both the Stone Age fantasy and the total hoax theory.
If you read just 8, if you read that and then you still call it not a hoax, okay. I would stay with what I have written, what I have published.
The Stone Age myth was dead, but the real story of the Tasaday was just beginning. At the time when these conferences were ongoing, the Tasaday controversy was about to enter a darker chapter. After fleeing the Philippines, Amanda Elizalde settled in Costa Rica and purchased Hacienda Estate, but the Costa Rican government issued an order to expel him, citing allegations of diddying minor girls and involvement in prostitution and racketeering. Remarkably, Amanda managed to slip back into the Philippines sometime between late 1986 and August 1987. His return is made possible by connections to the new Aquino administration. Back in the Philippines, Manda launches a counterattack, replying to the accusations made against him, such as stealing Panamin funds, the supposed harems, and other bizarre accusations, and that they were
absolute lies. All of these accusations are absolute lies, based on gossip, on rumors, and have no basis in fact. All these accusations are foundless. They are based on gossip, rumors, and deliberate lies.
He established the Tasaday Community Care Foundation, or the TCCF, to serve as his primary vehicle for promoting authenticity claims. Operating in Manda's mansion in White Plains, Quezon City, the TCCF drew its leadership from his original Panamin associates. Fighting video with video, Manda produced a film titled Reply to 2020, directly countering Judith Moses' documentary that had exposed the alleged hoax. Just 1 month after Oswald Iten's visit, the original team returned to the rainforest. John Nance, alongside other researchers, traveled to the Tasaday area with NBC television crews, ready to document their findings. What they encountered was a community in transition. The Tasaday still wore some leaf coverings, but they also exhibited clear signs of change, having leapfrogged into the 20th century. The team maintained that the Tasaday were authentic, but argued that they have become victims of forced culture change.
If after 15 years the Tasaday has not changed and they will still be wearing the leaves, they would indeed be fakes. Because nobody stays stagnant and frozen in time after 15 years. It's probably too much to ask of the Tasaday for them to remain what they are in 1971. It's now 1988. And they have intermarried with the Manugubli.
Researchers published their conclusions from this visit, both in an academic journal and notably in the Manila Standard newspaper, which happened to be owned by Manda Elizalde. John Nance defended the tribe's authenticity and claimed those who recanted to Joey Lozano had themselves been coerced into calling the Tasaday fake. Then, the issue turned deadly. One of the so-called Tasaday relatives, who was brought by Salazar and had testified against Manda at the 1986 conference, was murdered.
May epekto pa ba ang pagkamatay po niya sa pananaw ninyo sa buong controversy?
Pinatahimik nila yung tao. Wala naman kaming stakes sa bagay na yun eh. Ano naman ang stakes namin? Bakit ako nagkomento? Nagkomento ako bilang anthropologist.
An atmosphere of fear descended over the controversy. The hoax claims slowly vanished from the Filipino press after Manda's return. Those who had been critical of the Tasaday, such as Mariano Mondragon, had eventually recanted their previous statements, claiming that he and an official from a logging company launched a campaign to discredit them. In 1988, Manda Elizalde filed what was described as the largest libel suit in the history of the Philippines.
But a prestigious Manila law firm has offered to help the Tasaday, recently filing a suit on their behalf to seek legal redress and protection from the detractors who claim they don't exist.
He and several Tasaday members sued academics and journalists who had promoted hoax claims for 200 million pesos. The defendants included academics such as Zeus Salazar, Jerome Bailen, and journalists from various media companies. The lawsuit claimed hoax allegations had damaged the Tasaday's identity and were being harassed by various interest groups for their land.
They have been deeply hurt and asked, and we quote, "Why do they want to harm us? We have done no harm to anyone."
Anong kinalaman ko dun sa harassment na yun? Wala naman akong ginawa kung magsulat tungkol sa report. Na ang report ay hindi pwedeng that's all.
Yun po balik kasi...
Wala akong kilala sa kanila, no? Yung members ng mga Tasaday, walang kinalaman yun sa Si Elizalde yun.
Pero kasi yung...
Kapagkat yung mga Tasaday na yun, ay nasa kanyang bahay sa anumang lugar yan dyan, no?
Sa White Plains.
White Plains.
Pero legally po, sinunod po yung pangalan.
Legally, okay lang yun. Pero ang ibig sabihin, illegally, sinama niya yung mga tao. Anong alam ng mga Tasaday tungkol sa Philippine law? Wala, Elizalde yun.
Okay po. So, gets ko naman din po yung
kung
position.
Kung may hinaharas dyan, ay kami ni Biden. Halimbawa, mga ilang beses na dinanan ako ng mga tao na kung hindi ko alam kung saan galing, na tantanan na si Elizalde. Pero matatakot ba ako sa mga ganyang bagay na nabuhay tayo sa mundo at mamamatay tayo? Normal yun, hindi ba?
As Manda Elizalde employed various methods of intimidation, including using goons to harass and follow them, and even bugging their phones, hoax proponents either temporarily left the Philippines, such as Zeus Salazar going to Germany, where his wife was originally from, or completely went into hiding, such as Jerome Bailen, where he was being targeted by CIDG officers to arrest him and be taken back to South Cotabato. Then, in May 1997, at the age of 60, Manuel Elizalde Jr. died of cancer after a long illness. To his defenders, Manda was a flawed idealist, if the Tasaday were the most honest thing he has ever done. To his critics, a calculating con man.
Ang maganda kay Elizalde ay kailanman hindi niya ko direktang tinangkang suhulan.
Never po?
Never.
Kahit po nung unang ano ninyo?
Wala. Meron, yun lang panahon na si Nance ay pinuntang pa ako sa UST.
Yun lang po yung time
na gusto niya sumama ako sa Tasaday.
Manda, in my view, he was a publicity hound, and he was this person who was romanticizing the Tasaday. I don't think that. I think he believed in the Tasaday too at first. He he brought Charles Lindbergh, the famous pilot, there, and he was interested in the Tasaday for a while, but the way a cat is interested in a shiny toy for a little while. And to him, they were a kind of entertainment too, and he was the sort of white savior. And then he lost interest, and I think that was really kind of terrible too, on his part.
John Nance served as a pallbearer at his funeral and remained the Tasaday's most devoted defender. He tends to track down detractors with obsessive dedication. He traveled halfway around the globe to counter arguments from those who called the Tasaday fake. At one point, examining a visitor's register of his Tasaday exhibit, Nance noticed an unsigned critical comment and seemed ready to track down even that anonymous critic.
It was one strange thing once John Nance appeared at our newspaper in Zurich without any announcement, and I was not there actually. So unfortunately, of course, I would have met him. So he tried to force his way into the office of the editor-in-chief. Personally, I have nothing against John Nance. He's an interesting character in that story. So I still don't know what he wanted to achieve.
With Manda Elizalde gone, the machinery he'd built quickly collapsed. His son, Miguel Elizalde, closed the TCCF and locked away all its files. The organization that had spent nearly a decade fighting to defend the Tasaday simply ceased to exist. John Nance would continue the work personally, establishing a new non-profit called Friends of the Tasaday. At the start of the new millennium, the heat surrounding the controversy began to die down. New developments have been made, and most of the parties involved have moved on from the controversy. To quote Zeus Salazar,
"Sa totoo lang, sawang-sawa na ako sa kontrobersyang ito."
The Santa Cruz mission also changed their stance on the Tasaday in recent years.
Recently, the Tasaday invited us to go in to see how they lived in caves. And our people now believe what they say about themselves, that they are Tasaday, that they speak a different language, that they have a different way of life. And so we have changed our opinion, yes, in recent times.
Lawrence Reed finally gained access to those long-lost 1972 cave recordings. It confirmed Reed's studies at the 1989 AAA conference, showing evidence of separation from neighboring groups for roughly 100 to 150 years, maybe 5 or 6 generations, not thousands of years. Meanwhile, journalist and author Robin Hemley spent years investigating the controversy, which was soon compiled into a book titled Reinventing Iten. Hemley's conclusion was carefully measured. There was no real hoax, he argued, at least not in the way critics claimed. The Tasaday were real, living, breathing people, a genuine minority tribal group, but they were absolutely not a Stone Age tribe. According to Hemley, the Tasaday were what Claude Lévi-Strauss called pseudo-archaics, a remnant group that had fled deeper into the forest centuries ago, possibly escaping a measles epidemic still remembered in their folklore as fugu. They had reverted to hunting and gathering, forgotten some farming practices, and lived isolated enough to develop distinct speech patterns.
And so I had this whole list of Tasaday words. And so when I went to Tasaday the second time, we were in the rainforest. It was Amirara, myself, and the sort of Tasaday matriarch duel. And I just asked her the names of various plants. And there were some amazing plants. I remember this one fruit. I've never seen it since or before. I asked her the names of these different plants. And the names she gave me, I said, what are the names in Tasaday? And she told me. And they all exactly corresponded to Douglas Yen's word list from 30 years before. Now, if they were just local farmers pretending to be cave dwellers and none of this had benefited them in any way, why would they keep up this story 30 years later and remember all of these words that they had given an ethnobotanist 30 years before? It's just kind of absurd to think that. She knew her way around the rainforest really well, and she gave me these words that Douglas Yen had collected, and that was also a very convincing moment for me.
For Hemley, what became clear was that neither side was exactly right, but the authenticity side was more right than the others.
Even though I have, let's say, problems with both sides, I would say right now that the thing I object to most in some ways of the hoax side is how so many of their arguments were dependent on smearing other people, and rather than actually just presenting their cases.
Like Nance, Hemley supports the position that the local journalist Joey Lozano deceived Oswald Iten, Judith Moses, and other media outlets who supported the hoax narrative due to Joey's personal and ideological motives against Marcos and Manda Elizalde.
But in fact, what I realized was that the real hoaxer here was Joey Lozano. He had his own motives. I'll talk about, they were monetary, they were political, they helped him in terms of publicity. He became a kind of star, a cause celeb, thanks to Judith Moses. He was featured in the committee to protect journalists. He was considered a hero, but in my mind, he was anything but. My feeling is that Iten was duped as well by Lozano. Everything of those interviews is suspect. Remember, it was a completely controlled environment. He brought everyone in to Datu Galangs, had the Tasaday come there. He was the person who orchestrated the interviews. If you say Manda was orchestrating everything on the authenticity side, Lozano was orchestrating everything on the hoax side. So he was his own kind of mini Manda.
The academic community began to shift its focus. In 2004, the University of the Philippines held a symposium to discuss the current status of the community. 2 years later, a larger forum was convened. This event commemorated the contentious 1986 conference, but aimed to move the conversation forward, away from the tired question of hoax or authenticity, and toward the practical implications of ancestral domain claim in indigenous rights. Novelist Jessica Hagedorn also fictionalized the controversy in her work, changing the names but keeping the essence of the tragedy. But the story of the Tasaday was not forgotten. In 2009, Filipino journalist Cara David decided to make the journey to the Tasaday caves themselves. She interviewed Dul, one of the surviving Tasaday, who lived in a nipa hut after marrying a Manobo Blit in the 1980s. Cara David made it clear in her documentary that she was not trying to answer whether the Tasaday story was a hoax. Her goal was to give the Tasaday the opportunity to speak for themselves, a right denied to them for decades while they were photographed, studied, debated, and eventually forgotten.
Sekut ye moloi kut femkeng fetengen anik kelalu tetau menit ke beng ye kambong ge yu fenlenek ye kum ketau tu ne ye sen gen kedah se ye namat mo tekeng da tau mi sekum be ni kum lugar.
Nawawala na ba kayo ng pag-asa?
Sige mi femden tidak na ite la wan tengen la pulung tebaye bau ye udea la tengen tedu ke lebet temangat. Dengan mina fafdile mi sini kum benua bokrasi mi tau dah kum kekeng mi tau mi kum.
But one figure remained loyal to the end, John Nance. The journalist who had written the original account, who had been accused by critics of being complicit in the deception, never abandoned the Tasaday.
I think it ruined him ultimately. Again, I think that's a smear that I think Judith Moses and others have always tried to smear the other side, and that the Tasaday caused him it ruined his career. and was much more of a headache than it was cottage industry. I would say he was more like a true believer, that he became a kind of camp follower of the Tasaday. To say it was a cottage industry makes his motives seem like, they're all monetary. And they weren't. You would have known that he was like almost a religious convert, in the way he viewed the Tasaday as the real hope for humankind.
When Nance died, a moving ceremony to bring his ashes to the Philippines was held in 2013. They were presented to the Tasaday to be taken back to the rainforest. Among those present were the remaining researchers and also Dul, as she had lived throughout the entire saga. And then, in 2025, Dul passed away. Her life has spanned the full trajectory of the controversy, from living in the caves as a child, to being dressed in leaves for cameras, to experiencing modern life, into marriage, and the slow fade from global attention. With her passing, the original generation of the Tasaday controversy came to a close. Going back to the question, are the Tasaday a hoax? Perhaps the question was wrong from the beginning, as it assumes there is a simple yes or no answer. Like most things involving real human beings, the reality is far more complex and nuanced. Whatever arguments remain among proponents on both sides, one fact is undeniable. The only losers in this entire discourse are the Tasaday themselves. While researchers debated in conference halls and journalists filled stories from their hotel rooms and offices, real people were left to navigate a world that had turned them into a spectacle, a mystery, a scandal, and finally, an afterthought.
To me, it's a cautionary tale, and it's sort of an early example of media manipulation and the idea of, fake news. I think it's more just about bias than it is about people trying to fake something. It's about confirmation bias, and people wanting to believe what they want to believe. And in that way, it's a really fascinating story, because it's not about the Tasaday finally, it's about media, it's about people who see other people as entertainment. And that's largely what the Tasaday story is. It's a story about gossip, it's a story about innuendo, about mudslinging, about people with their personal agendas and professional agendas, and the Tasaday always got the short end of the stick. I think to reduce it to sensational claims just perpetuates a kind of injustice against the Tasaday.
The Tasaday deserve what they were denied from the beginning, to be seen not as symbols or curiosities, but as human beings with agency, with dignity, and with the right to define themselves on their own terms. The Tasaday story should serve as a reminder of what happens when the powerful impose their narratives on the powerless. The impact of this injustice, if not acknowledged and addressed, will reverberate and continue to carry over for generations to come.